Glain, yay. OPG, fantastic. Great to have you guys here on the call today. It's going to take you back to your days in hydro, Bob, with people from OPG on the call.
Exactly.
That's great.
I'm just noting the demographic of your participants too, Glenn.
What are you noticing about that?
There's no men.
Or they're being very quiet.
Yeah. Oh, there's a John. So we got a John with us here.
Oh, and an OPG connection there as well from John. Love that.
There you go.
Yeah, we've got diversity happening on the call, and yet connectedness. Love it when that starts to come together. Beautiful. All right, everybody. I know we're going to have some more people streaming in, but this is going to be such a dynamic conversation. I want to kind of jump right into it. So just a couple of logistical things before we get started. We're going to keep the lines muted, but please do use the chat, or there's an, ask a question function. You can put your questions in there as we go along. Bob and I have kind of crafted a few questions and things to get us going. But this is really your session, and what we want to do is to make sure you get your questions answered. So I'll be kind of coming back to it, but don't feel like you have to wait for a formal break to ask a question. Throw it in there. I'll keep my eyes on it. If I miss something, Shelby will keep me honest and we'll jump in and interrupt. But we're going to get started. So Bob, one of the things we talked about doing was actually starting with a land acknowledgement. So I'd love to throw it to you to do that for us today.
For sure. Well, first of all, let me say it's great to be here, Glenn. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and have this chat with you and your colleagues and friends. And I'm actually in the traditional territory of the Lekwungen and Esquimalt and Songhees nations here in sunny Victoria today. A little bit cold, what we think is cold, which is -2 or something. Something like that, but to us that is, there's a huge Arctic cold front, and for us it feels like -50. So it's just, we're all, our puffy jackets just aren't cut out for this weather. But great to be presenting. I'm not actually from here. I come from northern Vancouver Island, so the Gwawena First Nation is my home territory, as it will. Hegums and my mom's village is Kinkum Inlet, which is the Saudena Nation. So, like I say, just acknowledging all of those territories, and certainly where you are today, from Toronto and Ontario. If you're right in Toronto, it's you're on Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and then of course I see people from maybe broader than just Toronto, so the Algonquins and Anishinaabe and all of those other folks where you're I don't know, dialed in. I can't think of the right word, where you're zoomed in from.
Yeah, I love that, and I love taking that moment to acknowledge. And you and I had an interesting conversation about that, which I kind of we'll circle back, and I'll get you to talk a little bit about your background. But for on land acknowledgement, I said to you when we were pre-calling, I said, I'd love to do land acknowledgement, but I've actually had some people say, oh, that's just a performative thing. And I'd love to get your perspective on, why, is it important, why it's important, and what the folks on the call should think about as we're hearing more and more. I know my daughter's school does it at performances we've been at. We've certainly done it when we've opened our conference, but would love to kind of hear your perspective on land acknowledgement.
Yeah, super important. Where I was born and raised, the right and proper thing to do is land acknowledgements. If you there's this thing called tribal journeys, and the canoe peoples all along the coast of British Columbia will travel around by canoe, and everywhere they go through protocol. And we're talking hours, because there'll be 50, 60 canoe families, and they'll pull up to the shore, and the host nation will be there to greet them. Welcome to our territory. Please feel free and safe to come ashore. And we look forward to learning and sharing. And then each canoe family will have to do the same thing. Thank you for welcoming us to your traditional territory, for ensuring our safety and happiness and keeping us warm and fed and very customary. And it happens in meetings too. I was in a meeting in Prince George, and they had an elder get up to try to save more time for the meeting. The elder said, "So there, I've done the protocol. Now nobody has to do it," but it didn't stop anybody from doing it. And unfortunately, I was like one of the first two. So I followed the elder's instructions. I'm like, I didn't do the land acknowledgement, but then the person beside me was like, "Well, I'd like to acknowledge that we're in." And then that was it. We spent a whole hour because we had to go around the whole table and everybody had to thank the elder. And so very important. It's only performatory, or if you don't mean it, and you should mean it. It's a very decolonizing and indigenizing piece of reconciliation. And I will say, Glenn, I get a lot of critics on why I don't do it. And so far, I'm standing by the guns. It's the right thing to do. It's the proper thing to do. It also undoes some of the history. When we think about Christopher Columbus discovering the New World, you acknowledge that the Haudenosaunee, this is Haudenosaunee territory in Mississauga. So you're really decolonizing that one little piece of history, because Columbus would say this was a vacant land, right?
Right.
This
Right.
was vacant for whatever crown to discover it and claim it. And then when they did find people to sort of bolster and justify their position, they said, well, they're not actually people. So these are less than people. They're not persons. So how can they own land? And so there's this sort of very colonial history that we can undo just in saying, I'd just like to acknowledge that, I'm calling today from the Lekwungen and Songhees and Esquimalt Nation territory. And remember the Canada 150? A lot of my retail clients were calling me to say, "Bob, normally we jump on this national celebration stuff and we have all kinds of sales and things, but we've been hearing rumblings from some of the activists on social media, and so we're a little bit apprehensive. Should we be involved in the Canada 150?" And again, it's all about decolonizing and indigenizing the history we have. That's sort of reconciliation in a nutshell. And so what I was telling people was, follow the city of Vancouver's lead. The city of Vancouver was celebrating Canada 150 plus, so they had a little plus just to denote it. And if you ask them what the plus was for, it was their way of saying to Indigenous peoples that, Canada's 150, but the Haudenosaunee are like this, right? It's like 16,000 years. And so, and I said, if you do that, you can run those ads, and the activists won't come after you, because they're just trying to decolonize and indigenize that history. So there you go, a little bit of land acknowledgement insight.
Well, which I love, and I think this is such a good transition over to your book. And so this is the book, for those of you who haven't seen it, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. And I said to Bob, I thought he was being exceptionally generous with that title, because I said he should have called it 21 Things You Definitely Do Not Know About the Indian Act if you are a white person who's been whitewashed with history lessons through your whole life. This is, I think, such an important book for all Canadians, without question, to read, but I think it goes far, far beyond that. But I think for those of us in Canada, you've done such a beautiful job unpacking a legislation and an act in a way that is accessible and makes it very understandable. But also, I think, when you talk about Columbus's arrogance and thinking he discovered a new world, I think I said to that was sort of the two things that I really took away reading the book, was the arrogance that white European settlers had when it came to looking at this new world, and then also the false myths that were created around lack of leadership within the Indigenous communities, and the need to be taught, how to do things. And one of the things that I loved, that, and we sort of subtitled this talk this way, was the idea of the 7 generation view. And so I'd love you to sort of talk about that to the group a little bit. Tell us a bit about this seven generation view and how that affects how decisions are made and the thinking that happens within the Indigenous community.
Yeah, so the seventh generation view really is a view that Indigenous peoples have, although I would say it's attributable more to certain sets of Indigenous peoples. That the principle, seventh generation principle, is common amongst Indigenous peoples, but I think, you know, people out your way, Indigenous peoples out your way, really encapsulated it with the seventh, what they call the seventh generation principle, which really means, you know, whatever we do, our kids still have to be here and doing what we think is important, and they can decide, you know, what they want to do with it. But our obligation is to be looking at those seven generations into the future to make sure that they have something to inherit, something to be the custodian of, and so it does, you know, it definitely changes your view of, you know, decision making, right? If you're a Fortune, you know, 100 oil and gas company living by the seventh generation principle, I'm not gonna, you can't just keep developing and not be uncertain about what seven generations looks like, you know, or a forest company or a mining company or, you know, or a local government. They just worry about things longer in the future, which affects your relationships and how you conduct business. Like you know, I'm going to work really hard not to, you know, offend you when I know that we're really together for seven more generations and our kids. You know, so it sort of flies in the face of ruthless mercenary businesses, you know, for profit, and how, you know, leaders typically think about growth, and you know, we think about growth. We I'd love to grow my company, but it can't be at the expense of the kids. So if I was doing something that was harmful to the environment, that would be a real no-no, because, you know, we really want to leave it as good, if not better, as opposed to we're prepared to take acceptable hits on the environment. Well, at some time, you know, at some point, and we're seeing that now, we're running out of acceptable impact to the environment. It just, you know, we're just going to reach the tipping point, and we see that in, you know, global weather patterns and all kinds of things like that. So that's the seventh generation principle. It really does put a lot of pressure on us to worry about the future, and to think of ourselves as custodians for people in the future. We're just custodians. We don't own it. It's not ours to, you know, make a gajillion dollars and, you know, have a nice house in the Bahamas, which I would love. I mean, that sounds fabulous, right? But in the grand scheme of things, yeah, you know, we can't, you know, at some point the resources on this planet are finite, and they run out. And, you know, can you consciously think that what you're doing now is okay when you know that you're really contributing to that? So those are some of the ideas that are encapsulated in the seventh generation principle. Our kids still have to be here doing what we think and feel is important, and it's our job to make sure that happens.
Yeah, and I really, I mean, I think about that, like when we spoke about that first, it really did make me pause to think, how would decision making change in our organization if we applied that lens to some of the things that we think about doing? And even I know you and I talked about, you know, oil and gas is a great industry to talk about. Like if the people that were making the decisions about some of the environmental things that were going on with oil and gas actually had to live beside that, you know, strip mining spot, or, you know, would they make the same decisions? And I think that I love the way the seven generation view really gets you connected to the ripple effect of that versus this very short term mentality that we have in terms of, well, we're here, we're making decisions that'll last for the period of time that I'm here in this organization.
To tell a mining executive, look, we're going to give you your permit, line, but you've got to go live on the mine site. That's where you're going to live now, and your family, and your kids. You think that miner would change their view? I'm pretty sure they would. You know, they're conducting themselves. But again, from a leadership perspective, it makes such a huge difference too, that we have to work out the conflict. We have to, when you study conflict resolution, we have to be soft on people but hard on the problems. We're very much, a lot of the leadership that we see today is blind. You're not performing, we've got to get rid of you if you don't perform. That's really hard on people, and it's all to meet some unsustainable revenue projections and that kind of stuff, right? And so we need to just sort of flip that around a little bit and be soft on people. And so when you look at Indigenous cultures, whether it's a feather, nobody gets to talk unless you have the feather or a talking stick or something like that, and everybody gets a chance to speak. And when that I think about the average colleague. I spent 12 years at BC Hydro. If I'm thinking I'm not going to be here forever, I behave differently than if I'm going to be here forever. And if I'm going to be here forever, I've got to figure out how to work this out with Glain so that, we can both, be at peace while we're enjoying our employment careers. So that's some of the things that I think really, are affected by this longer term perspective. And then the other thing is, as from where I come from, and I can't talk about leadership from other cultures. So for people's just sort of background, there's 11 major language families broken up into over 50 different dialects in Canada. So really a culturally diverse group of people. And so what I'm talking about is where I come from, just one of 600 bands in the country. And there's different, when I think about those language families, there's different as Spanish is to Japanese. What they want and what the Anishinaabe want and what I want are probably two different things. And, if you ask me, and I get a lot of questions because the Indian Act is a very homogenizing force, right? It makes us all Indians as opposed to really, you'd be looking at a map of Europe, right, where you've got all these different language groups and peoples, and so that's part of the challenge. And so when I think about leadership from where I come from, everything is for the people. Like in the Indian Act, I talk about in the 21 things I talk about, potlatching. So potlatch is a Chinook trade jargon term. So my dad is a hereditary chief and I will inherit his chieftainship. But in order to do that, I have to understand, one, that he's a custodian. And he's always told me this, I'm just a custodian. And we've got a set of masks, for example, the legend of CBD carved by a really world-renowned carver who since passed, a guy by the name of Bo Dick. We're probably sitting on, $2-3 million of masks. Like if we took those to market and sold them to collectors, that house in the Bahamas, it's right there. Right? And but the problem is we're custodians. Those aren't our masks. Those are for our kids, and we're going to try and leave them for the next generation and for the rest of the family. But potlatching, in order to be a good leader in Kwakwaka'wakw society, which is where I come from, you have to give away gifts, and it's all part of a ceremony where we celebrate birth, death, puberty. We transfer names, songs, crests, titles, hereditary chieftainships. All happens in this potlatch event, and so I'll host a potlatch post-pandemic, hopefully, and I'll have to. Personally, I'll give away, probably $40,000 or $50,000. My family will all chip in because it lifts the family up. The more you give away, the higher your rank. That's how you get to be a CEO in our world, Glenn. And if you're not giving it away, as opposed to what we see happening now, where all of my bonuses, and just some of the crazy stuff that you see happening on Wall Street, for example, you get no respect. For me, I look at corporate America, and my hero is actually Warren Buffett, because he's a chief. He's the highest ranking chief of them all. He made all of that money, but then he gave it away to the people, and that's what you're supposed to do where I come from. But the government and the missionaries didn't like it. They thought, oh, these poor backwards people, they're giving away everything. They're not leaving anything. They just don't know what they're doing. We've got to save them from themselves. But we're never giving up potlatch. I can remember that this has been a reconciliation conversation in myself in these, decades that I've been here. And I can remember my dad first coming to me, and the only time he talked about the importance of school, because he went to one of those horrible residential schools,
Mm,
and he never talked about it. You know, it's like a World War II veteran. They came back from the Pacific Theater, and they just didn't talk about it. He didn't. But one day you know, in my early teens, he came up and he said, you know, better get a good education. You're going to have to get a good job to give it all away. And at that time, you know, I hadn't really been introduced to the culture, and I was like, no way, man. I'm keeping that money for myself. But now I understand, if you want to be a true Kwakwaka'wakw leader, you've got to give it away, and it
oh,
makes sense. You know, I don't need that much in this world. I don't have to. I'm really to a point in my life where I hate stuff, because you got to move stuff, pack stuff, store stuff, insure stuff, sell stuff. You know, buy more stuff, and it's just crazy what, you know. What we
I love this, because, you know, the thing that's really occurring to me, because we talk a lot in our leadership work about core values, you know, and understanding your core values as an individual. And then, you know, we kind of elevate that up into the core values of an organization, and what are the kind of core behaviors that become very evident. And what you're making me think of is the core values of a culture, you know, and I've thought for a long time that the individualistic value, this profit over people value system that exists within capitalism is, you know, as you're talking, that's what's coming up for me. I'm like, you know, this is a clash of core values, right? At that level that we're really talking about. And I think a lot of us in westernized cultures have been sucked into that belief system, and yet it doesn't feel good for a lot of us, right? A lot of it rubs against our core nature as people who want to be part of a community and help each other and support each other. It creates that I have more than you, and this hierarchy and all of those kinds of things. That's what's coming up for me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, it's funny. You go and, you know, you're surfing the internet, you find a company or a government, oh, we value people. And it's like, yeah, they value you, but you miss those numbers, and
Until you miss your
yeah,
quarterly.
yeah. See you later, sucker. And then, oh, by the way, we want 10% more out of you every year. Like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm already doing 100, so you want 10 more, and then the next
Yeah.
year 10 more, and you know, it's just, you know, at some point, you know, why do we need so much? Why do we need to take so much? So I wrestle with it, probably like a lot of Canadians and
Mm,
people tuned in here today. You know, is it really necessary to have all of the things that we have, and
yeah.
growth for the sake of growth? Because it's, you know, when we look at it, humans have impact. I understand that, but we're doing way more impact than, you know, we would be entitled to, I think, if I was looking at it culturally. And
Mm,
you know, we found a pretty good peaceful coexistence. And just so you know, remember I told you governments thought, and churches, because they were not so separate in the 1920s in Canada,
mm,
thought that we were primitive cultures and we lived short, brutish lives, and that, you
yeah.
know, we did these potlatches, and there was all of this sort of myth making that went on about what they didn't understand, what they couldn't
Yeah.
see, and the reality is, when we look at the West Coast here, for example, I know it's different in Ontario and other parts of the country, but we were fish cultures, and so, you know, the Fraser River had, you know, 7 species of salmon or 6 species of salmon, and sockeye was probably the most prized. And at the time of contact, there were 100 million sockeye swimming into that river system every year. And it was more fish than you could ever eat or do anything with. But when you start to put that into perspective, um, you know, they live short, brutish lives is a total myth. That there was a group of people that was working less than 9 weeks a year to get through Maslow's first 2 levels of the hierarchy of needs, food and shelter, leaving the rest of the year 40 plus weeks a year to develop really sophisticated, really advanced, you know, systems of governance and, you know, religious views and all of the things that are the hallmark of really, you know, advanced societies with lots of wealth, resources, and leisure time. You totally would have found in a fish culture. So,
Mhm.
you know, what I went to my dad one time and I said, Dad, what do you say to people that say we live short, brutish lives? He'd say, hey, man, you tell them we were working less than 9 weeks a year and we weren't paying taxes.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Have we got it better? I mean, it's interesting because I just finished the book Sapiens, and that is one of the things that he talks about in the book, is when we went from the hunter gatherer to the farmer view. And really, our lives have not gotten better since that point in time, actually, right? I want to sort of, as we're sort of talking about, the core values differences and cultural differences, I want to sort of bring it into the workplace, because I mean, your organization really does a lot. Well, that the core is to do training around Indigenous peoples, and we had a really interesting conversation when we were talking about this whole idea on so many people's agendas right now is diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is the topic du jour starting last year in a big way. And so one of the things that we talked about was this idea of, when we're looking to balance our teams, when we're looking to bring more diversity in, there's so many potential pitfalls that, when you're the dominant culture in an organization that you need to kind of be aware of. And I know you've done a lot of work when you were with Hydro around getting better balance. And so I'd love to kind of have you sort of share the story of, for companies that are looking to bring more Indigenous people, but I think the lesson could apply to anybody. Really, what do we have to be thinking about? What do we have to be considering if we really want to make a commitment to broadening, right? The people that we see around the table and the diversity in our companies. Give us a bit of a view to that.
I think it'll take a commitment because, we largely were operating on a set of assumptions that there's a market of 36 million people, and that in that market there's X number of these and X number of those. And so we shouldn't have any problem meeting our targets and our numbers. And so that's how we were thinking when I was first invited to work on recruitment and retention at BC Hydro. One of the first lessons we got was that we were operating on a set of assumptions. So with that many people, we do the big advertising blitz, we do radio, we do print, we do TV, we do all of it. And we did that. We committed and came up with, something that normally works wherever we're doing things, right? And we do this great big blast, and then we sort of have the notion that all we got to do is sit here smugly and wait for the candidates to start piling off of the truck. And but it didn't happen. And we were recruiting this, we were looking for people who were in trades. That was our bread and butter. That's what we needed. Power line technicians. We were facing a situation where over 1,200 people a year were eligible for retirement with a superannuated pension. Like, there was no reason to stay with Hydro once you hit the age. And and they were, what I was told, were on the 1 in 30 program. Tick them off once and they're gone in 30. And and so we were faced with that. So we were recruiting for this bread and butter thing, 1,800, 2,000 jobs a year. We're just gonna need to keep filling those seats. And so we did this big advertising thing, and anyways, we waited for the truck to back up, and the door fell down, and like nobody really got out. And it was like, whoa, I mean, we can't be that bad of an employer here. Like, why aren't we the employer of choice? Because they all talk about wanting to be the employer of choice. And clearly we weren't the employer of choice, or weren't we? We just didn't know. We had to go through some sort of fact finding. And we reached out to the Ministry of Education. And that was probably, we thought, let's take a look at everything. And this was just one of the elements. But to be a power line technician, you needed Nat 12, Physics 12, and English 12. And so we sent a request to the ministry. How many people last year, Indigenous people, self-identified, identified that they had these three things, our musts, Math 12, English 12, and Physics 12. And so we got the English numbers, we got the math numbers, but it was the physics one that really told us that, what we do for this segment isn't going to be what we do for other segments, that we would have to change our approach. And what we found was, in that year, there were just over 70 people. I can't remember if it was 71 or 72 Indigenous people in the whole province of British Columbia had graduated with Physics 12. So that meant we were competing with engineering schools and other firms, and And so that was the reality. And, you know, to think that we could just do what we normally do, that was our commitment. We realized we were going to have to commit differently. And so we did. We started to think about how can we really work with this segment? So we, you know, began to do lots of different things, scholarships designated specifically to Indigenous peoples, you know, job fairs, job shadowing, bringing people in for summer jobs, you know, just anything and everything we could to show them that, hey, this might be a place. And we needed to step back and track, right? So our commitment wasn't just let's get people now anymore. Our commitment is like 10 years. We got to be thinking about 10 years really, so that we can get them thinking about the sciences and some of the great opportunities that we had. And so we did that, and we went from, you know, very low numbers of Indigenous peoples within the ranks to, quite high numbers in the hundreds, 300 people, I think, by the time I left, which was 2004. And it was largely because there was a lady there by the name of Jeannie Cramer, and she was the one that really said, okay, if you want to do this, this is what we're going to have to do. We are going, you know. And so when people, you know, one of the first things we did was self-identification when they're coming in the door. And I think this could work for all of the sort of the target groupings, but this is just what we were doing for Indigenous peoples. Do you self-identify as an Indigenous person? Are you specifically Indian, Inuit, or Métis? And then they would pick a box. And as soon as that happened, that would trigger workflow. There would be a sequence of events. Okay, Glain just self-identified as an Indigenous person. A note would go to Jeannie and would say, Glain has just applied for a job. She self-identifies as an Indigenous woman. And then Jeannie would reach out to Glain and say, hey, really glad you applied. Tell me more about yourself. If you had, she was really looking for some of the background stuff. You know, if they were from the reserve, they were a lot less prepared for a corporate interview where you're supposed to sell yourself and do all of that.
Well, yeah, I love what when we were talking earlier, you really talked, one of the things you mentioned was the different ways people show up, right? The cultural differences that if we were putting it against a Western standard, the individual may not meet the bar. I think that would be super helpful for people on the call. Like what are some of the biases that we have to be aware of?
So, yeah, I come from a collective society as are Indigenous peoples across the country. And what that means is they think a lot like your union people and to some extent really hardcore. And for interviewing, we expect people coming into the door. Hi, I'm Bob Glain. I can do this job. I'll be here early. I'll leave late. I've got the credentials. Really, you don't even need to talk to anybody else. But in the community that I come from, I'm not allowed to sell myself. They will get upset with you if you sell yourself. I did this and I did that. So I'll give you a good example. A young woman from one of the communities on Highway 16 went to university, very intelligent, smart, got the degree, went back to work for the community, doing social sort of work for the community. And UBC graduate. I mean, it's hard to get into UBC and to be a graduate and finish a program and all that stuff. Went back to work in the community. After about a year of service, they invited her to the annual general meeting. They said, Barbara, tell us what you did for us this year. And so following the instructions, like she would in university, she went to the community, and an AGM, if you don't know what that looks like for a medium-sized community in the hundreds, it's a recreation center that functions as a community center that does a whole bunch of things. And so recreation center, tables, chairs, bleachers, and there'll be a podium and a microphone, and that's a community session. And she gets up, and following the instructions she was given, she said, I did this, and the next thing I worked on was that, and then I did this. And one of their really high-ranking hereditary chiefs stands up in front of the whole community. And we talk about this in another book, The Use of Humor. They're teasing her. He gets up and just very politely says, excuse me. And when this guy stood up and talked to everybody, that's like your CEO wanting to say something. You do not interrupt, right? And you shut up. Even if you're the presenter, you shut up, right? Excuse me. And everybody goes hush, and he just very politely says, "Are you an optometrist?" And the whole crowd just erupts into laughter. And then it goes quiet. And then she starts to say, "And the next thing we worked on was this. And then we worked on that." And it was her way of responding to what he was doing. What he was saying was, "Hey, man, you're not doing this. We put you there. We're working on this
Mm,
together. You're there because we want you there. And you need us and we need you." And there was so much going on in that little joke, that little
yeah,
piece of
yeah.
humor, that she really had to make the shift. But for a recruiter, you just got to understand they're not good at selling themselves. They're not allowed to sell themselves. It's a
Right.
cultural trait. So they don't perform well in interviews. If that's your bias, is that I want somebody to sell themselves. What about handshaking? Lots of people shake hands. I'm a handshaker. If we met and this was a public session, I'd shake your hand. But
Mhm.
it's not very common in Indigenous communities. My dad won't shake your hand. You can walk up to him and have your hand out like this the whole time, and he won't look at it. He won't shake it. He might bat it away. I don't know, but he's not a handshaker at all. And so yeah, and then couple that with eye contact,
Yeah.
because in an oral society, talking and listening is much more important. But eye contact is really critical to some people. It's one of their verbal cues that this would be a good fit employee. I'm sorry, you're going to be really disappointed. Don't even go and look for them, because you're just going to start kicking them out on things, your expectations, not theirs. And
Mhm.
if the goal of a recruiter, I think, is to find good candidates who will work hard, not to judge them based on what they think is important, like eye contact, handshaking, selling self. Those are some of the real cultural considerations when it just gets into interviewing. How do you get rid of some of those things where there's less eye contact? They're, not going to handshake. They're not selling themselves. I've met lots of recruiters, man, they don't look me in the eye. They don't shake my hand. I don't even finish the interview, right? So that's why
Well,
I'm
and
saying.
I'm even thinking too, what I'm thinking must be a barrier. And so tell me where my mind's going. And those of you in the audience, to get your questions in there. This is going to be, we've got another 15 minutes or so. So don't be holding back now. This is the time to throw in your questions. But I'm curious, Bob. So because when I think about the work that we do, and we're with, these companies that are, big performance targets, high performance, profit, results. And I'm marrying that up with this idea of, if you're coming in with a culture that is much more community based, family based, you're taking this longer term view. I'm thinking about what great performance looks like from the eyes of the company, given the construct that's there, and the potential barriers of style and approach differences. Like if you're more of a team-based leader or a community-based leader, I'm curious about what you've seen and observed for Indigenous peoples who are trying to work within the system that they're finding themselves in, and the ability to kind of climb that ladder. Like, what are some of the things that organizations can do to create more space for potentially different approaches and styles? Because I'm guessing that could be a bit of a trip up for a lot of people.
For sure, yeah. They're stuck on the main value is, if they're a for-profit entity, the main value is for profit.
Mhm.
That really, when I see it just as an outsider looking in, that's just at the expense of everything else. And, until we're able to move away from that really unsustainable sort of ideology, you can't keep going up and up and up and expect not to have impact in the rest of the world, that kind of stuff. So with that being the main value, capitalism's really the problem.
Mhm.
For us, when I was talking about that Kwakwakiwak hereditary chief, capitalism was important. We wanted capital, but we wanted to give it away and do
Mhm.
things better. And if you're thinking like that, in the end, I just want to give this money to all the people in this room here, or this valuable item, because it just really depends on the culture. When you're doing that, you're also not as harmful as you're not as harmful to the environment if we're having acceptable, losses and impacts to wildlife and habitat. We just keep growing. you're not thinking like that at all. And
Mhm.
so that's probably going to be one of the bigger changes. What is good growth? What are we doing this for? And I'm a weirdo. I would say, hey, I value the leader that'll give it away. They're earning it to give it away, and that is all about people. So we need to value people and not profit as much. And I think you can have both worlds, but we're just in our consumer world, we're just not hardwired that way. Put the people
Yeah.
first, and profits will still happen. But do
We
we
say it,
do
but
we
I think
really need
to the point you said earlier, we say it, but we don't follow through on it. Our actions don't align with that, you know, conversation about we put people first for the most part. And what I'm really thinking about, because we got a lot of people in the audience I know that are leaders in their organization, or they're in the talent management function within their organization. And what's kind of coming, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, if I was in this organization that is all about capitalism and shareholder returns, and yet I want to create a more inclusive culture and have more voices coming into the organization.
Mm,
There's a part of me that goes, is that even realistic though? Like, you're going to bring in people who, subscribe to a much broader view of the world. Companies operate within this box. We as leaders need to start having some of these difficult conversations internally around what's enough. Do we need to be driving that number and all of those kinds of things? But I think to myself, what can I do if I'm a middle manager, if I'm an HR person, what can I do to really affect change when the company's on this, I'm part of this big system myself.
well, I think they have to in a large way get involved and get on it. They're gonna be slow, and they'll have definitely hiccups. Those large companies, but I think the people within companies can make change and do great things um, with the little bit of scope that they're given. So back to Jeannie, she ended up bringing in over 300 Indigenous peoples with just that longer term commitment. And it's necessary, not just for the company, whether the company wants this or not. Remember, I'm thinking of the company as a separate legal entity, a
Mhm.
corporation as a separate legal entity, and it wants what it wants. But
Yeah.
we also, I think, in our lives, if we start to value society and looking after people, then we can start to take actions that are helpful to society as a whole, like whether it's Black Lives Matter or Indigenous peoples or women or persons with disabilities, LGBTQ, all of those things. We have to be more diverse, and
Mhm.
and without it, we're really we're not going to end up in a good place. We're a resource country, and we still aren't making the shift that we need to make to what are we going to do next. We're still trying to get every last little thing out of the ground, and then when it's done, then what are you going to do? Well, you met your targets, but where are you going to live? It's like kind of Al Gore's inconvenient truth, where he's looking at
Truth.
all the gold in the world, or just like that whole thing, right? And so I think though that the separate legal entity wants what it wants, but the people working in it can try to meet some other broader objectives that are useful, not just to the separate legal entity, but to their families, their communities, their church groups, their whoever they're affiliated. And I think that kind of diversity will actually be helpful to the separate legal entity in the long run, and it'll help with its survival, because I think there's just going to be less emphasis on the way things were, and some of the change that needs to happen. So I hope that helps, Glenn, just in terms of an answer to that.
Yeah, no, I think that does help. And I think the other thing that I'm thinking about here, and it sort of goes back to your book, actually, what I said to you about what I got out of your book. Um, I think that when you take that big macro view of the arrogance, right? The arrogance of, the white settler, and I think that's a lesson for any of us that are in the dominant cultural whiteness, is to stop being so arrogant and start being more curious. And so I think that we are in we're all of us are in operating within systems, and we have processes in place that come through the lens that we have been put on. I mean, it was white men, and then white women got more up the food chain and organizations. And I think, there's a really big opportunity for all of us to step out and get curious when we hear other voices in the organization talking about new ways of doing things or new ways of looking at things, not to dismiss because it's not part of the Borg, like I always think of the Star Trek, like that Borg mindset. But that it's something that, maybe we need to pause and go, how can I get curious about this? This isn't in my social frame, but what could I learn here? And what could I adjust based on the learnings that I'm getting from somebody who has a different worldview and a different set of core values coming into the organization.
Sorry, was there a question there? I liked what
No,
you were.
I just like that's my own reflection on listening. But I do see a question in the comment. It says from Linda is saying, my organization needs to do more diverse hiring, especially for certain groups, including Indigenous. Are there a couple of organizations you can recommend who can provide us some early guidance, knowing that it is our job and commitment that is required?
There is. I just can't think of them off the top of my head. I never. I didn't wrap my head around that while I was wrapping my head around this conversation. So I'll try to remember Glain, and I'll share with them.
Yeah, we could send that out in the follow-up in terms of potential resources and everything like that. I mean, I think so, Bob, let's circle back on the book for a little bit. So when you wrote this book, what was the goal that you had for the book? What was the hope that you had when you decided to tackle this particular topic?
Yeah, so the main goal would be to get rid of the Indian Act, and that was the primary reason. But there's a whole sort of long history. So I was very fortunate at BC Hydro I worked in customer services and human resources and advertising and display, but I also worked in Indigenous relations, where I was an Indigenous awareness trainer, and I would help Just Hydro employees, have conversations about what the future looked like for the firm around, generation and distribution of electricity, and how central Indigenous peoples were going to become in that whole conversation, and that they would bring their values with us, with them, and we'd have to, find some ways to deal with the values alignments that, challenges that we're obviously going to have. And so that, that gave me an opportunity to do training that was helpful to people. And so one day I ended up thinking, it's great that I can help all of these corporate entities, these government agencies, they all have money. But maybe, there's lots of people on the other side of the screen here who maybe don't have money, can't afford to press the buy now button. And so I started blogging as a way to keep giving back, beyond just my career and professional life. And I've had to fight my wife on this, who's a lawyer, and she's really old school, where you develop something and you keep it and you sell it. You don't give it to anybody else they're willing to pay. And I was suggesting, no, we got to get back. And, and so I started blogging about things I was learning, training just hundreds of thousands of people in, since the mid 1990s. And so I just started putting out little articles, 400 words, kind of one a week, and then, a little newsletter to let people know we got the more recent articles, social media to amplify. And so it's all part of a way to give back. And one day I read a blog article on how to be a good blogger, and it said, people love lists. And so you should, if you can think of anything that you do that you can create a list from, people are super curious. Lists just have high open rates and high conversion rates. And so that's the mercenary business Bob talking. So I wrote an article, and I just thought of the Indian Act. Okay, 21, I didn't need to have a number. I just started typing, okay. Hereditary chiefs, elected chiefs, women lost status and they couldn't do pool halls. And it was stuff that I remembered from being in the room with all of those people over the, 2.5 decades, and sort of cranked it out. And there's way more than 21 things. Those are just the ones that hit the top of mind. And, edited it up, hit publish, and then did a social media amplification. So Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, shoveled it out for the masses if they were interested, and it went viral. fact, 55,000 people in the first month from Facebook, just that Facebook post landed on that page and then came to the website, and it just lit up. And so it was a bit of an aha moment, that, maybe there is a chance to get into a whole other sort of segment of society, the book readers. And I thought, this has really hit a nerve. I wonder if this will, I wonder if this has got legs. And so I reached out to some people that were just starting a company, ex-booksellers. They've gone through lots of restructuring, and they started their own company because they liked the word, but they just didn't, weren't able to hang on to jobs. And I said, what do you think? And they said, Bob, unlike the other authors that we deal with, a lot of authors will come to us and say, I've got this idea for a book. It's about purple widgets, and I'm going to make it super exciting, and there's going to be gangster widgets. And, they've got these ideas for stories that they want to tell, but they never know if people want to read it.
Mm.
And Bob, that is what's different with what you're presenting here. People want to read it because, and they said, we're pretty bullish. We think that what happened online will happen in bookstores. And so that little book is actually 3 years old now, and it's still in bestseller lists, and it just keeps climbing and clawing its way and staying in the top 10 for all of the lists, and top 10 for Canada last year. And so pretty cool. But it was just, like I say, it's just a long answer for a really short, it was just to give back to people and to give them a chance to learn. Ultimately, though, I'm, when I'm writing about that stuff, that's my life in that book. I'm a hereditary chief. They deliberately wanted to overthrow me. They banned potlatching, forbidden to speak my language and culture, no regalia. I was being interviewed by a professor from one of the universities in Toronto. And it was right around the time where systemic racism was coming out of, everything that was happening last summer. And he said, Bob, do you really think systemic racism is a thing for Canada? What do you think? I mean, there's a lot of chatter here, but I don't know.
Mm.
I said to this professor, I said, absolutely. I mean, if there was a Stanley Cup or a Super Bowl ring, and a trophy for systemic racism, I mean, our name would be all over that cup for 100 years. I mean, the Indian Act is about as systemically.
Well, you know what, I have to say that was what was so shocking reading this book. And I said to you that, as a white person, I'm born in the UK, so I am like the roots of the European settlement, right? Is that, there was so many oppressive and discriminatory practices. And I do feel like as Canadians, we need to not hide in guilt and shame about it, and also deflect. Like, I mean, I think there's a lot of defensiveness. Well, that wasn't me. I'm not, this is now, da, da, da. But that's not the point. The point is that generationally, and, you look into the residential school system and all of the things that are, going on in there. It's deep. And so I think as a responsibility, we all have a responsibility to understand. We all have a responsibility to understand this. And I think what I loved about your book is that you make it very accessible, and the guilt and shame is self-inflicted, not you inflicting it as the author of the book. But you also lay out some really sort of simple things that people can do, everyday Canadians can do to support truth and reconciliation. And I'm thinking, as we're wrapping up here, if you were to say to the people that are listening, like, what are maybe one or two things that they can just easily put into practice that would support truth and reconciliation in Canada, what would you say?
So, if you look to the TRC calls to action, so for every organization, with people representing it here today, there's a call to action for you. And all of those calls to action say, help your organization learn about the history and the culture and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They're all very similar, those calls to action. And there's calls for churches and businesses and schools and governments. And so there's 94 calls to action. That's the first real big step that you can take, and just commit to doing what you're doing right now. You've jumped in on a call about the Indian Act and culture and some of those different perspectives. I think Once you get proficient, start sharing with your organization or finding ways to share with your organization, your church groups, your friends, your family, whatever you feel comfortable doing. I would say with a little bit of caution, Indigenous issues can really light up a dinner table conversation. So something to think about, is this the hill for me? And for some people, they're pretty comfortable with that, but sometimes, and one of my best friends, Doug, who I grew up with in Campbell River, was having a dinner party. He had invited guests that he didn't know. And he said it got pretty ugly, Bob. One of the guys and his wife started to really Indian bash. They're lazy, they're drunks, and
Mm.
so finally, Doug said I didn't really go after him. I just said, hey, Ken, I just want you to know, all of the stuff you're saying is there's only like a sliver, a small grain of truth, and that's all I had to say. And it just tempered the whole rest of the dinner, and people were able to get into a place. So I think, that learning piece, but I think really, just as a call to action, understanding how important it is for organizations, for people and their families and church groups and that kind of stuff today. We look at the Middle East, Israel and Palestine, and there's a group of people where there's been no peace for, I don't know, 2,000 years.
Mm.
I think about Black Lives Matter. And if we traced it back, it's to Reconstruction, and it's a Civil War issue that's still there in America today. And so we've got this opportunity where we've had this really horrible experience with Indigenous peoples in Canada that we largely didn't have anything to do with. But if we just leave it at that, it doesn't set us up for 7 generations or for another 2,000 years. We've got this really unique opportunity as a country to reconcile. And reconcile means to look back and, we remember the past, we live in this moment, but we really set it up for the future. And if we can do that, I think we leave this, and my dad actually went to Palestine, Israel, went to the Middle East with a bunch of spiritual, religious leaders, and they were fact finding. And if they saw any opportunity to help, they would try to, do that if they could. And so they went in, and he told me he was going, and I said, "Oh, you got to tell me what that's like when you come back, because like most Canadians, we don't really know anything about it." And, just sort of what we hear. Anyways, he came back, I let the jet lag wear off, and then I called him, 3 days later after his return, and I said, "So, Middle East, what was it like?" He said, "Oh man, it was so intense. Either side, if they didn't know you, they didn't trust you, they didn't like you, they had nothing nice to say to you." He said, "I got spit on. I literally got spit on. A bunch of us got spit on. And we're just a bunch of namby-pamby leftist, liberal, maybe wannabe do-gooders. But if they didn't trust you, they didn't want to talk to you." And he said, and I said, "Wow, I mean, that's really intense. So what's that mean to you?" And he said, we have to double down on reconciliation. We've got to get this country to reconcile with its past, to set it up for its future. Because he said, "I'm not leaving that future to my kids and your kids and your kids' kids and anybody's kids. That's just, we can't send this country into 2,000 years of acrimonious, hateful relationship based on myths and misconceptions. We've got a chance right now to really do something about this." And so we both said, "Yeah, let's do it. We got to double down on reconciliation." And I hope everybody here will do that. And the easiest thing, learning about that history and encouraging, academia to continue their work and governments to stay the course. And yeah, so there you go. Hope that's
Bob, thank you so much. I think we could talk all day long, but I am going to honor we're at the top of the hour. I just want to thank you so much. We will be sending out a recap of today's talk. I'll make sure that we get some links into Bob's work. He does, obviously, the Indigenous Training Corporation can come in and help you. Those of you who are on the call that are interested in that kind of training, I know he would be happy to have further conversations with you, what you can do in your organization. I know some of you had questions about recruiting. I'm sure we'll get some suggestions from Bob on that and include those in the follow-up email. So watch for that. Thank you everybody so much for being with us today. Bob, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and stories with the group. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks with Phil Buckley, who's a change coach, just released his new book, Change on the Run. So change is the new normal for all of us. Thank you everybody so much for being here today and for joining this important conversation. And go and buy this book for everybody you know. I'm telling you, it's easy read, important read, and super actionable for all of us. So thanks everybody. We'll see you soon. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Glain. Nice to meet y'all. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you.
See ya.